Mike had grown increasingly suspicious of his neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who always seemed to be hiding something. Her recent behavior only fueled his concerns. One afternoon, after witnessing something unusual, he called the police. When Officer Reynolds entered her house, he was stunned by what he found. He turned pale as he realized what Mrs. Jenkins had been hiding from her neighbors, and with trembling hands, he immediately called for backup. He couldn't deal with this on his own. "I'm telling you, officer, that woman is up to no good," Mike insisted as he led Officer Reynolds to Mrs. Jenkins's house. At first, the officer dismissed his concerns, assuming Mike was biased because of her disability, and he felt a twinge of sympathy for the woman. Little did he know that Mike's suspicions were correct, and he was about to uncover something truly shocking in her home. As he approached the front door, he noticed it was ajar. He rang the doorbell and knocked a couple of times, but no one answered. Growing concerned, he pushed the door open further and cautiously stepped inside, calling out for Mrs. Jenkins. He feared something had happened to her. Then, in a dark corner, he saw something that made him freeze in place. No one had seen this coming. "What the hell?" Officer Reynolds exclaimed as he realized what was going on, and he called for backup. He needed his whole team on this case immediately. Mike was right, and the reality was far worse than anyone could have imagined. But what did the officer discover in Mrs. Jenkins's house? Where was she? And why was Officer Reynolds so shocked by this discovery? Mike always trusted his gut instincts, and they were telling him that Mrs. Jenkins was definitely hiding something. He was certain of it, even though he had no idea what it could be. From the beginning, he had found her somewhat strange, but whenever he brought it up with other neighbors, he realized he was the only one who didn't completely trust her. They all seemed to love her, and no one ever mentioned anything odd about the woman. However, the more Mike observed her, the more convinced he became that something was off. For instance, as Mike paid closer attention to Mrs. Jenkins and her interactions with other people, he realized that she never received any guests and that none of the other neighbors had ever been inside her house. He wondered why. Whenever someone was supposed to come by for coffee or drop something off, she would cancel at the last minute, claiming she wasn't feeling well, or she would talk to them at the door, never inviting them inside. When Mike mentioned his to his wife, Sophia, she scolded him, telling him to leave that poor woman alone. She thought he was being ridiculous and didn't share his suspicions for even a second. However, Mike wasn't going to let this go. Mrs. Jenkins lived right across the street, and from his home office window, he had a clear view of her front door. What he observed only strengthened his suspicions. Lately, she kept her curtains closed almost all day and seemed extra cautious whenever she entered her house, always checking if anyone was nearby. If she hadn't been hiding something before, she certainly was now. Mike wanted to take action, but he wasn't sure what to do. He was clearly alone in this, as none of the other neighbors seemed to have any suspicions about the woman. So, he came up with a plan. One day, after he saw Mrs. Jenkins leave the house, he snuck out and went to her front door, pretending to deliver some of Sophia's freshly baked cookies. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called after knocking on the door, glancing around as if searching for Mrs. Jenkins. Then he walked around the house and peered through the windows. He knew that the house was empty because he had seen the woman leave earlier, but suddenly he saw one of the curtains move. How was this possible? This meant that there had to be someone inside. Mike was determined to find out what was going on, so he made his way to the back door and tried the handle, but it was locked. Despite his disappointment, he was certain he had seen the curtain move. Just as he was about to investigate further, he heard a voice behind him ask, "What do you think you're doing?" Mike turned around and was shocked to see Mrs. Jenkins standing there, demanding an explanation. Her eyes were sharp, and her expression stern. "What do you think you're doing, Mike?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mike stammered, caught off guard by her sudden appearance. She didn't look pleased to see him snooping around her property. "I was just, checking on something," he managed to say, feeling a pang of guilt for invading her privacy. He stuttered, saying he brought cookies, and she thanked him, but warned him not to peek through her windows. "Cookies?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's nice of you, but you really shouldn't be peeking into other people's homes." Her tone was firm, but not unkind. Mike felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I just thought I saw something," he mumbled. Mrs. Jenkins sighed and accepted the cookies, her eyes never leaving his. Mike directly confronted her about the moving curtain, but Mrs. Jenkins claimed it was just her cat. "I saw the curtain move," he insisted, trying to keep his voice steady. Mrs. Jenkins tilted her head, looking slightly amused. "Oh, that must have been Whiskers," she said, smiling. "He loves playing with the curtains." Mike frowned, not entirely convinced. "Whiskers?" he echoed, trying to picture a cat causing such a commotion. He expressed surprise, stating he didn't know she had a cat, and she explained it wasn't allowed outside. "I didn't know you had a cat," Mike said, genuinely surprised. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her expression softening a bit. "Whiskers is an indoor cat," she explained. "He's not allowed outside because he's too curious for his own good." Mike nodded slowly, trying to process this new information. "I see," he said, still feeling uneasy about the whole situation. Mike, still skeptical, left and went home, puzzled by her explanation and behavior. He glanced back at her house one last time before crossing the street. Sophia was waiting for him at the door. "What was that all about?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously. Mike shook his head. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just some confusion." But inside, his mind was racing with questions. Mrs. Jenkins's story didn't add up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Sophia asked Mike where he had been, and he told her the truth about Mrs. Jenkins. "I was at Mrs. Jenkins's house," he admitted. "I thought I saw something strange, so I went to check." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "You did what?" she exclaimed. Mike sighed, bracing himself for her reaction. "I thought something was off, so I confronted her about the moving curtain." He tried to sound confident, but he could see Sophia's anger building. She was angry, insisting he leave Mrs. Jenkins alone and that the moving curtain was just her cat. "Mike, you need to stop this," she said, her voice rising. "It's just her cat. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Mike tried to protest, but she cut him off. "Enough, Mike. Leave that poor woman alone. She's done nothing to you." Mike could see the frustration in her eyes and knew he was fighting a losing battle. Mike promised he wouldn't stalk Mrs. Jenkins, but couldn't let go of his suspicions. "All right, I promise," he said, raising his hands in surrender. Sophia gave him a stern look. "I mean it, Mike. No more spying." Mike nodded, though his mind was still racing. Something didn't add up about Mrs. Jenkins, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He decided to bide his time and see what happened next. The next day, he noticed the curtains moving again when Mrs. Jenkins wasn't home. Mike was sitting by his office window when he saw it. The curtains in her living room fluttered, as if someone had brushed against them. His heart skipped a beat. "There it is again," he muttered to himself. He quickly grabbed his phone and noted the time. He knew Mrs. Jenkins wasn't home, which only deepened his curiosity and concern. Deciding he needed to expose the woman, Mike called the police to report his concerns. He dialed the non-emergency number and waited, tapping his foot impatiently. "I need to report something suspicious," he told the dispatcher. He explained the strange occurrences at Mrs. Jenkins's house and his growing suspicions. The dispatcher assured him that an officer would come by to check it out. Mike hung up, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Officer Reynolds answered Mike's call and listened to his story, skeptical but curious. "So you're saying the curtains moved on their own?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Mike nodded vigorously. "Yes, and I know she wasn't home." Reynolds sighed, jotting down notes. "All right, Mike, I'll come take a look," he said, his tone suggesting he didn't fully believe the tale. Nonetheless, the officer's curiosity was piqued enough to investigate. Without any concrete proof, the officer decided to check it out since it was a slow day. "I've got time," Reynolds muttered, more to himself than to Mike. He grabbed his keys and motioned for Mike to lead the way. "Let's go see what all this fuss is about." Mike felt a surge of relief and hope as they walked toward Mrs. Jenkins's house, ready to finally uncover the truth. Mike waited outside his house and thanked Officer Reynolds for coming, leading him to Mrs. Jenkins's house. "I appreciate you doing this," Mike said earnestly. Reynolds nodded, scanning the quiet street. "Let's just see what's going on," he replied. As they approached the house, Mike pointed out the living room window. "That's where I saw the curtain move," he whispered, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. As they approached, they noticed the front door was slightly open, raising their concern. "Did you see her leave?" Reynolds asked, his voice low. Mike shook his head. "No, I haven't seen her all day." The officer frowned, stepping closer to the door. "That's strange," he murmured. The open door felt like an invitation to trouble, and both men felt a sudden urgency to find out what was going on inside. The officer knocked and rang the doorbell, but there was no response from inside. "Mrs. Jenkins? It's Officer Reynolds. Are you home?" he called out, his voice echoing through the hallway. Mike stood behind him, his heart pounding. They waited for what felt like an eternity, but the house remained silent. "I don't like this," Reynolds muttered, glancing at Mike. "Something's not right here." Mike nodded, his worry growing by the second. Mike insisted Mrs. Jenkins was home since he hadn't seen her leave, worrying the officer. "I'm telling you, she hasn't left all day," Mike said, his voice edged with concern. Reynolds frowned, glancing at the open door. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. Mike nodded, his anxiety growing. "Something's wrong, officer. She should be here." Reynolds sighed, realizing he couldn't ignore the possibility that the elderly woman might be in trouble. Concerned about the elderly woman's welfare, Officer Reynolds pushed the door open further. "Mrs. Jenkins," he called again, stepping inside. The house felt eerily quiet, and a chill ran down Mike's spine. "We need to make sure she's okay," Reynolds said, motioning for Mike to stay close. The officer's professional instincts kicked in, driving him to check every corner of the house for any sign of the missing woman. He called out for Mrs. Jenkins, listening carefully for any reply, but only silence met his calls. "Mrs. Jenkins, it's Officer Reynolds. Are you here?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. Mike stood by the doorway, his nerves on edge. They waited, straining to hear any response, but the silence remained unbroken. "This isn't good," Reynolds muttered, sharing a worried glance with Mike. "We need to keep looking." Suddenly, they heard a faint crying sound, which made them both anxious. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered, his eyes wide. Reynolds nodded, his expression tense. "It's coming from inside the house," he said, straining to pinpoint the source of the sound. The soft, pitiful cries seemed to echo off the walls, filling the house with an unsettling atmosphere. We need to find out where that's coming from, Reynolds said decisively. Mike urged the officer to go inside, suspecting something serious was happening. We can't just stand here, Mike insisted, his voice shaking slightly. Reynolds nodded, gripping his flashlight tighter. All right, stay behind me, he instructed, stepping deeper into the house. The crying grew louder as they moved forward, each step increasing their sense of urgency. Let's find out what's going on, Reynolds said, leading the way with determination. Mike and Officer Reynolds entered the house, following the sound of crying. The eerie noise echoed through the dimly lit rooms, guiding their steps. Stay close, Reynolds whispered, moving cautiously. Mike nodded, his heart pounding as they crept deeper into the house. The crying grew louder, sending chills down their spines. Every shadow seemed ominous. Every creak of the floorboards heightened their anxiety. They needed to find the source quickly. Mike mentioned Mrs. Jenkins had a cat, but this sound didn't seem like a cat. She said she had a cat, Mike whispered, trying to rationalize the situation. Reynolds shook his head. That doesn't sound like a cat to me, he replied, his eyes scanning the room. The crying was distinctly human, filled with fear and distress. Let's keep moving, the officer said, his grip tightening on his flashlight. We need to find out what's really happening here. They searched the house, checking every room, growing more worried. Each empty room they passed added to their unease. Nothing here, Mike muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. Reynolds nodded grimly, his jaw set in determination. Let's check upstairs, he suggested. The crying persisted, haunting and urgent, pushing them to move faster. They exchanged a tense look before heading toward the staircase, the unknown danger driving them forward. Finally, they heard crying from a room upstairs and approached cautiously. It's coming from up there, Mike said, pointing to a closed door at the end of the hall. Reynolds nodded, signaling for Mike to stay back. Stay here. I'll go first, he whispered. He moved slowly, every muscle tense, as the crying grew louder. The sound was heartbreaking, and they knew they were close to uncovering the truth. They found a terrified little girl inside, staring at them with wide eyes, not speaking. Reynolds's heart sank at the sight. Hey there, it's okay, he said softly, trying to calm her. Mike stood in the doorway, stunned. The girl was huddled in a corner, her eyes filled with fear. She didn't make a sound, just stared at them, trembling. What's she doing here? Mike whispered, feeling a mix of confusion and concern. Officer Reynolds gently approached the girl, asking what she was doing there. Hey, sweetheart, it's okay. Can you tell us your name? He said softly, crouching down to her level. The girl stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. Mike stood back, holding his breath. The girl didn't say a word, just glanced toward the hallway, her fear palpable. Reynolds tried to appear as non-threatening as possible. The girl didn't reply, but ran into another room, locking the door behind her. Wait! It's okay! Reynolds called out, but it was too late. They heard the click of the lock, and the crying resumed, now muffled by the closed door. Great! Now what? Mike muttered, frustration evident in his voice. Reynolds sighed, trying the handle. We'll have to get her out of there. She must be terrified, he said, thinking quickly. Unable to break the door, the officer searched the room where the girl was found. Let's see if we can find any clues, Reynolds said, scanning the small, cluttered space. Mike helped, their eyes darting from one object to another. There's got to be something here that explains this, Mike said, rifling through a stack of papers. Reynolds nodded, lifting a blanket from the corner and revealing a small makeshift bed. He discovered a blanket, an empty plate, and other items indicating she had been living there. "Look at this," Reynolds said, holding up a half-eaten sandwich. Mike's eyes widened. "She's been living here?" he asked, shocked. Reynolds nodded grimly. "It looks that way. Poor kid." They found a few more items: a water bottle, a book, and some toys. "We need to figure out how long she's been here and why," Reynolds said. Officer Reynolds called for backup and ordered his team to track down Mrs. Jenkins. "We need more help here," he said into his radio, explaining the situation. Mike watched, feeling a mix of relief and fear. "What do you think happened?" he asked. Reynolds shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to find out. And we need to find Mrs. Jenkins." The urgency in his voice was clear, and they prepared for the next steps. More officers arrived, but the girl remained locked in the room, and Mrs. Jenkins was missing. "We need to get that door open," Reynolds instructed one of the officers. They attempted to coax the girl out, but she stayed silent. Meanwhile, Mike looked around, growing more anxious about Mrs. Jenkins's whereabouts. Where could she be? He wondered aloud. The additional officers spread out, beginning a thorough search of the house and surrounding area. Using the girl's description, the police identified her as Tate, who had been declared missing. "We've got a match," an officer said, showing Reynolds the information on his phone. "Her name's Tate. She's been missing for weeks." Mike overheard and felt a chill run down his spine. "So she was here all this time?" he asked, bewildered. Reynolds nodded, his face serious. "Looks like it. Now we just need to find Mrs. Jenkins." Reynolds's team confirmed her identity with Mike and showed him a photo. "Is this the girl you saw?" the officer asked, holding up the picture. Mike looked closely and nodded. "Yeah, that's her," he confirmed. "I can't believe it." Reynolds glanced at the photo, then at the locked door. "We need to get her out of there safely, and we need to figure out what happened here," he said, determination in his voice. Suddenly, they heard yelling outside the door, realizing Mrs. Jenkins had returned. "What's going on here?" a voice screamed from the hallway. Reynolds and Mike exchanged a look before rushing out to see Mrs. Jenkins, red-faced and furious. "What are you doing in my house?" she demanded. Reynolds held up his hands to calm her down. "Mrs. Jenkins, we need to talk," he said firmly. "There's a lot we need to explain." Mrs. Jenkins created a scene, angrily confronting the officers about their presence. "You have no right to be here," she shouted, pointing a finger at Reynolds. "This is my home." The officers tried to calm her, but she was relentless. Mike watched, stunned by her outburst. "Mrs. Jenkins, we found a missing girl in your house," Reynolds said, trying to break through her anger. But she wasn't listening, her fury only growing. Mrs. Jenkins yelled that they had no right to break into her home. "You can't just barge in here," she screamed, her voice shaking with fury. "This is my private property." Officer Reynolds tried to calm her down, but her anger only seemed to escalate. Mike stood to the side, watching the scene unfold, feeling a mix of confusion and vindication. "We had reason to believe someone was in danger," Reynolds explained, trying to maintain control. Officer Reynolds tried to talk to her about Tate, but she became angrier. "Who's Tate?" Mrs. Jenkins snapped. "I don't know anyone by that name." Reynolds took a deep breath, trying to remain patient. "The girl we found in your house matches the description of a missing child named Tate," he explained. Mrs. Jenkins's face turned red with rage. "You're mistaken. I don't have any missing children here," she shouted, her voice rising. She insisted that wasn't the girl's name and refused to cooperate. "Her name is not Tate," Mrs. Jenkins yelled. "You're all wrong, and I won't answer any more questions without my lawyer." Reynolds exchanged a look with Mike. who was growing more concerned by the minute. "Ma'am, we need to resolve this situation," Reynolds said firmly. But Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms and shook her head. "I'm done talking," she declared, her defiance clear. The police took Mrs. Jenkins to the station for questioning, while Tate was also brought there. "Let's go," Reynolds said, escorting Mrs. Jenkins to the patrol car. She protested the whole way, but the officers remained firm. Mike watched as they led Tate out, the little girl clinging to her teddy bear. "We need to get this sorted out," Reynolds said, glancing back at Mike. "I just hope we can get some answers soon." Tate finally unlocked the door, looking scared but relieved to leave the house. "It's okay. You're safe now," an officer said gently, helping her out. Tate clutched her teddy bear tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Mike felt a pang of sympathy as he watched her. "Let's get you somewhere safe," Reynolds said, guiding her to the car. Tate glanced back at the house one last time before getting in, her relief palpable. At the station, Mrs. Jenkins was interrogated, insisting she was only helping the girl. "I was just trying to help her," she exclaimed, her voice filled with frustration. The officers remained calm but firm, asking her to explain her actions. "She needed a safe place," Mrs. Jenkins continued, her hands trembling slightly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." Despite her insistence, the officers pressed on, seeking the truth behind her story. Tate, though not speaking much, appeared healthy despite her circumstances. She sat quietly in a small room at the station, clutching her teddy bear. An officer brought her some water and a snack, trying to make her feel comfortable. "You don't have to be scared," he said gently. Tate nodded slightly, but remained silent. Despite the fear in her eyes, she looked well cared for, a small comfort amidst the confusion. The police contacted Tate's mother, who rushed to the station immediately. "Thank you for finding her," she said, her voice breaking with emotion over the phone. The officers assured her that Tate was safe and asked her to come in as soon as possible. Within an hour, she arrived at the station, her face etched with worry and relief. "Where is she?" she asked urgently, her eyes searching the room for her daughter. Mrs. Jenkins continued to defend her actions, claiming she wasn't a bad person. "You have to understand," she pleaded. "I was trying to do what was best for her." The officers listened, but their expressions remained skeptical. "Taking a child without informing anyone is a serious matter," one officer said. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "You don't know the whole story," she insisted, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm not a bad person." The girl's mother arrived, anxious to be reunited with her daughter. She hurried into the station, her eyes scanning the room until she saw Tate. "Tate!" she cried, rushing forward. Tate looked up, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Mommy!" she exclaimed, running into her mother's arms. The room filled with emotion as they embraced, the mother holding her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God you're safe," she whispered. It was revealed that Mrs. Jenkins was Tate's grandmother. "She's my granddaughter," Mrs. Jenkins admitted during the interrogation. The officers exchanged glances, understanding more of the complex situation. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" one officer asked. Mrs. Jenkins sighed deeply. "I was afraid they wouldn't understand," she said. "I did what I thought was right." Her revelation added a new layer to the story, leaving everyone in the room momentarily stunned. Tate's father, Mrs. Jenkins's son, had passed away a few years ago. "My son died, and it changed everything," Mrs. Jenkins explained, her voice cracking with emotion. "Tate was all I had left of him." The officers listened, noting the sadness in her voice. "It must have been hard for you," one officer said gently. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "You have no idea," she whispered, her pain evident. Mrs. Jenkins disliked Tate's mother and had taken her granddaughter away. "I never thought she was good enough for my son," she confessed. "After he died, I didn't trust her to take care of Tate properly." The officers tried to understand her perspective, but her actions were still illegal. "Taking a child without permission is a crime," an officer said. Mrs. Jenkins looked down, her defiance mingling with regret. "I know," she muttered. She had taken Tate from school and kept her hidden in her home. "I picked her up one day and never took her back," Mrs. Jenkins admitted. "I thought I was protecting her." The officers shook their heads, understanding the gravity of the situation. "You can't just take a child like that," one said firmly. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, finally seeing the consequences of her actions. "I just wanted to keep her safe," she repeated softly. Tate's mother was unaware of her whereabouts, as Mrs. Jenkins lived far away. "I moved to keep her hidden," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "Her mother didn't know where we were." The officers looked at each other, realizing the extent of the deception. "It's a miracle we found her," one said. Mrs. Jenkins sighed, finally understanding the impact of her actions. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said quietly. "I see now that I was wrong." Tate was returned to her mother, and Mrs. Jenkins was arrested for kidnapping. The reunion between Tate and her mother was filled with tears and relief. "I missed you so much, Mommy," Tate whispered, hugging her tightly. Meanwhile, officers led Mrs. Jenkins away in handcuffs. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her eyes downcast. The gravity of her actions had finally set in, and she knew there was no going back. Mike explained everything to Sophia, who was shocked by the revelation. "You were right all along," Sophia said, her eyes wide. Mike nodded, recounting the events that had unfolded. "I knew something was off," he said. Sophia shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe Mrs. Jenkins did that," she murmured. The weight of the situation hung heavily between them, and Sophia squeezed Mike's hand, grateful for his persistence. Sophia acknowledged that Mike had been right about Mrs. Jenkins all along. "I thought you were just being paranoid," she admitted. Mike smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's good to trust your instincts," he replied. Sophia nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and relief. "You did the right thing, Mike. You helped that little girl," she said softly. Mike felt a warm sense of validation, knowing his suspicions had led to uncovering the truth. The neighborhood slowly returned to its usual calm, with life resuming normalcy. The buzz of the recent events began to fade, and neighbors went back to their daily routines. Mike and Sophia noticed fewer whispers and more friendly smiles as they walked down the street. The quiet suburb regained its peaceful charm, though the memory of what had happened lingered. It was a reminder that sometimes things aren't always as they seem. Mike felt a sense of relief, knowing he had helped uncover the truth. Sitting on his porch, he watched the sunset, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Sophia joined him, and they sat in comfortable silence. "I'm glad it's over," Mike said finally. Sophia nodded. "Me too. You did good, Mike." He smiled, grateful for her support. Despite the turmoil, he knew they had done the right thing, bringing light to a dark situation.